Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, topics, book events, and publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. It's August 10th, 2020, the day after the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki. And my guest this hour, appropriately enough, is Greg Mitchell. His 12th book is The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's just out from the good people at the New Press and already earning rave reviews. The Beginning or the End was a B movie about the A-bomb, released by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in February 1947. It promised to disclose what it called, quote, the biggest, best kept secret in the history of the world: the men, the magic, the machines behind the world's strongest force, the atom bomb. The movie was, the studio declared in all capital letters with exclamation points, factual, authentic. Well, not quite. Because a movie set in motion by scientists wanting the world to know the truth was taken over by the military and the White House needing the world to believe a lie. How that happened is the business that occupies Greg Mitchell in his 12th book, The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It's not just a great yarn with some amazing participants, it's also an urgent warning about secrecy, manipulation, and suppression. Those are frequent topics for Greg Mitchell. I had the pleasure of interviewing Greg 8 years ago this week for a related book, his important expose, Atomic Cover-Up: 2 U.S. Soldiers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Greatest Movie Never Made. Among Greg's earlier books, 2 fascinating looks at politics in California: The Campaign of the Century, about Upton Sinclair's radical campaign for governor in 1934, which won the Goldsmith Book Prize, and Tricky Dick and the Pink Lady, about Richard Nixon's red-baiting campaign for the Senate in 1950. He is a former editor of Editor and Publisher magazine, Nuclear Times, and has an important place in the history of rock and roll journalism as the editor at Crawdaddy, who commissioned the first major profile of Bruce Springsteen even before that first album was released. And Bruce returned the favor in 2013, writing the preface to Greg's So Wrong for So Long: How the Press, the Pundits, and the President Failed on Iraq. Greg is on Twitter at Greg Mitch, writes for the Daily Beast, and blogs at gregmitchellwriter.blogspot.com. I was between shows in 2016 when Greg published The Tunnels, Escapes Under the Berlin Wall, and the historic films the JFK White House tried to kill. You may notice a theme emerging, so I'm very happy to welcome to Madison BookBeat one of my writing heroes, Greg Mitchell.
Well, thank you. That's quite a mouthful there, but thank you for all that.
Well, you've had quite a career, and it should be duly noted. And you're having quite a rollout for the new book. You've been writing and making films about Hiroshima and Nagasaki since the early 80s, even without the excitement of a book launch like this year and in 2012. Is this week an emotionally intense time for you as well?
Well, it is. It's been, not only is it the 75th anniversary, but it's a time when there should be reconsideration of the atomic bombings. It's such an important act in our history and in world's history. And I guess you get emotional when you see the same old official narrative trotted out again and again, and holding sway in the media. So I mean, you mentioned a certain thread through my work. It probably relates to media manipulation, media involvement, all those political campaigns, and in the book you just mentioned about the tunnels, the Berlin Wall, and certainly the Hiroshima story. I think going back almost to the beginning, I have focused on the aftermath of the bombing, not so much the decision to use the bomb. Now, in my current book, The Beginning or the End, there is, I think, a rather profound look at the decision in retrospect. But most of my writing has been about the aftermath of, and not just on the survivors, but more on how America has reacted. So the focus has really been, what did America make of the decision? in those first crucial months and first couple years? How has it been handed down today? And we can get into this later, but I always see this as a topical, current, relevant story because the U.S. America still has a first use policy. Most people don't even know that, but you could call it the first strike policy. It's officially known as first use, and it means we continue to give the president all the authority and in the world to use nuclear weapons first in a preemptive attack when even threatened, not even in a conventional war, as with Saddam Hussein, let's say, but even a threat from Iran or North Korea or whatever. So, that's kind of a little bit of a summary of my focus in bringing this story to the, which seems, it seems like who would care about an old MGM movie or, you can't even change the decision to use the bomb. You can't bring back the dead, or you can't reverse the nuclear arms race of the 50s and 60s and 70s, 80s, all these horrible things. So why continue to write so much about it? And again, the answer is I think it has a very clear lessons for today that are not being heeded.
Because even a seemingly lighthearted topic like a Hollywood movie has an important and powerful impact by setting the narrative that people will come to believe. And this movie has a wonderful origin story and was essentially midwifed by the young actress who in the 50s and 60s would become one of America's favorite moms, and Donna Reed, and her high school chemistry teacher. Talk about how this all started to unfold.
Well, about 2.5 months after the dropping of the two bombs, MGM had already expressed some interest in maybe making a movie on the subject, but nothing serious. It seemed like none of the other studios were doing anything, surprisingly. And suddenly, out of the blue, Donna Reed, who was really just emerging as a star, she had just signed for the It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, and then she would win her one Oscar a few years later for in From Here to Eternity. Then her career stalled, and she ended up on TV. But she received a letter out of the blue from her high school chemistry teacher back in Iowa, who had been working secretly at the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge, and he sent her a lengthy letter, which I got a copy of, asking her to get Hollywood to make a big budget movie warning the country and the world of the dangers of nuclear weapons, the dangers of building more of them, possible nuclear arms race, possible use against Japan, and just almost panicky kind of letter. Fortunately, she was married to a Hollywood agent. He called studios, and the next thing you know, him and the producer Sam Marks were pitching it to Louis B. Mayer, the legendary head of the MGM studio. Mayer said it might be the most important movie he'd ever make, and set the whole thing in motion. The two men then went to Washington and met with President Truman in the Oval Office and a bunch of other people. And so the book is really about this kind of how this sort of started in a very unusual way, let's say, seemed to be on the path to reflecting the scientists' warnings and being something that would alert the country to the dangers. And then over the following year became completely flipped on its head, went in a completely different direction, and ended up being a little more than pro-bomb propaganda when it finally came out. So it's really the story of how this movie was manipulated and revised and rewritten to reflect what became the official narrative that we still see today. I mentioned, we still have this official Hiroshima narrative in place today, and this movie was one of the things that contributed to it.
And not only is the movie jump-started by Donna Reed, but it gets its title from the aforementioned President of the United States, Harry Truman, although nobody was supposed to know that. How did that happen, and what did that level of White House involvement portend for the development of the script as it played out?
Well, I mean, the two men met with Truman in the Oval Office, as I mentioned. He said, gave his approval. He said, make your movie, gentlemen, and but tell the people we're either at the beginning or the end. And they allegedly said, you You have just given our movie its name, sir. But indeed, that was the name that it went forward with. And but from that first meeting with Truman, they essentially gave him script approval, ultimate script approval. And probably even worse, they then met with General Leslie Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project, and someone who would be called a real hawk today. And not only gave him, they gave him script approval by contract, and also gave him $10,000 to be chief advisor, which was about $120,000 in today's value. Totally unprecedented. You might give someone who wrote a best-selling book that amount of money to option it, but you don't pay an advisor, particularly someone who had a stake in how the story came out. Here's a guy who had every incentive to defend the making and use of the bomb, every detail about it. He was someone who was intimately involved in not just the making of the bomb, which people know about, but in pushing Truman to use it, and helping select the targets for the bomb, and then afterwards trying to cover up radiation dangers. He called radiation disease just propaganda from Japan. He told Congress he'd heard it was a rather pleasant way to die of radiation disease. So, and here's a guy who's signed up by the studio for an allegedly, a movie that was either going to be very balanced or tilt towards the scientists, and made chief advisor. And indeed, as I show in the book, Groves was sent every script, and he made dozens, maybe hundreds of changes in it. He demanded change this, change that, and MGM generally went along. So I would say Groves was the main actor until near the end, when they screened the movie in Washington for the first time before it came out. And Truman's press secretary saw it and went back to Truman, and they raised alarms with MGM that they must reshoot the key scene in the movie where Truman explains his decision to use the bomb. And so it's very important to set this narrative exactly the way the White House wanted it. And so MGM, like a little puppy, went along and reshot at great cost. They even fired the actor playing Truman at the White House insistence, replaced him with someone else, and reshot the scene so that it completely, down to the word, followed the narrative. I've seen the script revisions, I've seen all the correspondence from the White House and MGM's response, and MGM went word for word, whatever the White House wanted on that. So, it's appalling, it's revealing, and it's consequential because, as I said, that narrative remains to today. The movie is, most people don't even know about. So I don't want to make too big a claim on the movie's impact, but it was reflective of that era. So I think the whole book, while it focuses mainly on this movie, I think it offers a really vivid picture of this turning point in 1946 and 1947. We can talk about the John Hersey article if you want in the same period, things like that. But it was a real turning point, setting in stone this narrative about the bomb, which we still suffer from today.
Well, before we get to the changes that General Groves imposed, just finish up with what Harry Truman and Charlie Ross did. He had the actor give a much fuller explanation of Truman's decision-making process, but not a more accurate description of Truman's decision-making process. How off the mark was the words that came out of the actor's mouth? And did Harry Truman ultimately really know what it was that he believed and knew?
Well, I have a piece out of Newsweek this week, one of the many excerpts from the book that people can look for if they want, where I just getting to the last part first was Truman, of course, famously never offered any regrets on using the bomb. And he said, it's like there's a phone ringing in the background here. Sorry.
It's okay.
But it's not even my phone. Anyway, Truman never famously said he had never lost any sleep over it. And that may be true. But the book shows that what's interesting is when you go to Truman's diary, you not only get a better picture of why he used the bomb or what he could have done differently in his own words. People tend to accuse people like me and others of being Monday morning quarterbacks, or well, with the wisdom of hindsight, we say this or we claim that. But you can go back to Truman's own diary. You can go back to what Eisenhower coming out against the bomb before it was used, for example. And do that. But there's in his diary, Truman wrote two weeks before he used the bomb that he had been assured by his Secretary of War, and he was happy about this, that the target would be purely military or industrial, and that civilians would not be killed. Thank God. I don't remember the exact words, but it was thank God we'll be sparing women and children. Now, of course, that did not happen. In fact, Hiroshima casualties were about 90% civilian, and Nagasaki about 98% civilian. And Truman, in fact, 75 years ago from today, from this very date where we're talking, called off a third bomb when he learned of the massive civilian casualties in Nagasaki. So there's some, I speculate a little bit that Truman did not fully know in advance what the targets were, which was directly over the center of the two cities. And maybe he was even appalled at what he had done, and then sort of covered it up with himself psychologically for the rest of his life. That's pure speculation, but it's a fascinating historical fact that Truman may have in advance not fully realized what he was doing. But the movie is the movie scene that you're talking about, that I go into a great detail in the book because it was so crucial with the excerpts from the script and so forth. He knew what he had to do right there. He had to put forth the official narrative, which was that only the use of the bomb could end the war. The use of the bomb did end the war, in this view. It was the only thing. There were no real alternatives. It spared 1 million American lives. It's the only thing that prevented a U.S. invasion. And it was, signed off by, there was very little or no protest from within or from the scientists. The Japanese had been warned, for example, that it was coming. So now these things are all basically false. So we can go through what the actual facts are there, but it was important to put forth this narrative, and we still see them. I'd say the majority of the media, except in some op-ed pieces, continuing to say the same thing 75 years later, despite the emergence of so much evidence and facts and so forth that at least should raise severe questions. It is kind of amazing that we hear the same old standard lines all these years later without nuance. When at the minimum this should be a hot debate over this at the minimum, and we rarely see that.
We're talking with Greg Mitchell. His new book is The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. We're going to get into both the script's sins of commission about Hiroshima and the huge sin of omission regarding the absolute refusal to even acknowledge Nagasaki in a bit, and the role that General Groves played in those script decisions. But just to finish with Harry Truman and the actor, and then Eleanor Roosevelt and the actor playing FDR, we had these are apparently two early instances of cancel culture, because both actors were fired essentially because of their political views. What did people make of that at the time?
I didn't see much protest over it in the press. I don't know whether I'm not sure the average person cared much. In the first instance, the Eleanor got the very famous legendary actor Lionel Barrymore fired from playing FDR. He had seemed to be a great choice for this role, since he was in a wheelchair himself by then. But he had been a very active anti-FDR campaigner, one of the heads of the Hollywood anti-FDR group. And Eleanor didn't like that one bit. And so she basically forced MGM to can Lionel Barrymore, which was not that important in the end run, in the end. And Truman, the White House got the actor playing him, Roman Bonin, who was a well-known character actor, got him fired. The stated reason, which was bad enough, was that he lacked military bearing to play Truman, of all people. But there's certainly evidence, perhaps, that they had found out about that his activist past. He was quite possibly a former member of the Communist Party. Certainly was on the far left in any case. And that didn't stop MGM from hiring him, because this was just months before the blacklist started. The book also shows how this intersected with the coming of the Hollywood blacklist in the summer of 1946, the first articles naming names and so forth. So there's a lot going on in that year, 1946, including the first atomic tests in the Pacific, the Bikini test. And so there's a good deal in the book about the scandal of the Bikini test and the islanders who were never allowed to return home, and the fallout from the contamination of U.S. sailors from the test and so forth. So, and then, as I mentioned earlier, the John Hersey article came out in August of 1946. So 1946 was just an absolutely incredible year. And so it was interesting to follow it all the way through.
You also mentioned the actor Frederick March being suspect because people thought he might have been a communist, which is very funny because when he was at the University of Wisconsin in the early 1920s, he was a member of the campus Ku Klux Klan fraternity, and the university a few years ago took his name off the small theater in the Memorial Union because of that association. So to see him a generation later being suspected because he's too far left shows something interesting about perhaps his travels as a grown man. Now, while all this is happening at MGM, the rival studio Paramount has already been working on a movie which Hal Wallace announces on the 4th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And the best part of the Paramount episode is the screenwriter whom Hal Wallace wants to write this is the celebrated novelist Ayn Rand, who's riding high off the recent publication of The Fountainhead. Now, how bad a choice was Ayn Rand to write a screenplay based on a collectivist government-run enterprise and to do it on time?
Well, that's a good point. Most people don't even know she was a Hollywood screenwriter, but she had already by that point written 2 or 3 screenplays, and Wallace had her on retainer for 6 months out of the year. So, this was her half-time career, you might say. So before she took the assignment, she made sure Wallace knew pretty much what she was going to write or what her line might be. And I was able to go through all of her papers at the Motion Picture Academy in Beverly Hills, all of her outlines, her correspondence, all of her work on the scripts and so forth. But she said in advance she was going to make this, again, a tribute to freedom, a tribute to individual action, individual scientists, Americans who could be the only ones who could create this, partly because of this individual and because of industry's involvement, which most people don't even think about in the making of this bomb. And her especially did not want to give much credit to FDR as launching it and sticking with it and spending all this money. So, and she was somehow, I guess, because she was already by then a well-known novelist, she was able to sit down with Robert Oppenheimer twice to interview him, which did not happen with MGM. So she picked his brain twice, and she wrote 55 pages of her script, which was, we don't have time to go into it, but it's quite wild and wacky.
It was turgid.
Quite wild and wacky, and I think Hal Wallace, when he read it, sort of said, "Boy, this is a big mistake," and so he basically sold out to MGM. He almost very suddenly decided after the press had built up this incredible race. You can call it like an arms. This is like an atomic race to make a movie, and then almost overnight, Wallace decided to sell out to MGM. So there, in the end, there was only one movie. Now, Ayn Rand made good use of her free time then by immediately sitting down and beginning to write Atlas Shrugged. And in fact, she based the character, scientist Stadler in that book, on Oppenheimer. So, there's that twist to the story as well.
And she also, it seems like she made some useful notes about her interviews with Oppenheimer. I mean, she seemed to record some interesting perspectives that he was sharing with her. Were those notes that she left about her interviews useful from a historical or personal perspective?
Well, yeah, a little bit. They're kind of sketchy, but it's basically she found Oppenheimer to be kind of a tortured individual. Certainly, he came across that way later. So she kind of saw this early on. He was very conflicted about the making and using the bomb, and certainly he was, but he was claiming that the scientists did not have to follow orders from the military and from General Groves, which is kind of debatable. She also interviewed Groves, and so yeah, it's interesting, but it did all come to naught in a way, because the film was never made. I guess we could say thank God, but the MGM movie was bad enough. Anyway, that atomic race did end.
Now, the prologue of the MGM movie talks about the bomb saving millions of lives, which, as you noted, was not true. As the screenplay developed, how quickly did it leave history for propaganda?
Yeah, of course, once, in fact, Donna Reed warned her former teacher when he first contacted her. She said, "Okay, I'll help try to get a movie made." She did not end up starring in it, but I have to warn you, anything in Hollywood's going to be rewritten. So, and this is certainly true. So, on the one hand, you can say, revising the script, nothing unusual, but the way the script was revised, who revised it, and the entire direction it went in, it was not necessarily, it was revised to make it more dramatic or cinematic or whatever. It was changing facts or taking out facts that were troubling for the official narrative. So, I mean, you mentioned one of the most dramatic and revealing was early in the early scripts had plenty of scenes involving Nagasaki. The plans for that bomb. They even had Cardinal Spellman blessing the crew. They had the explanation for why they needed a second bomb. All that was in. So there was, Nagasaki very much was a part of the early drafts. But as it went along, it was lowered and revised, and by the end, it was cut out entirely. So you could watch that movie today if you dare, and you would not see a single mention of Nagasaki. And of course, the reason is that, and again, I could refer you to another excerpt from the book, which is at the Daily Beast right now, on why Nagasaki, even from the beginning, was morally troubling to many people, including conservatives and military people and religious figures. That the use of the Nagasaki bomb, even if you could defend the Hiroshima bomb, the Nagasaki bomb was virtually a war crime, if not an outright war crime. So this was already in the wind then, and so the White House and the military really wanted to get rid of it in a way, and so they did. So the movie does not have any mention of Nagasaki, and there are numerous other revisions and falsifications which reveal our psychology, if you want to say. For example, they inserted the fact that we had dropped millions of leaflets warning specifically of the atomic bomb coming. And this was complete nonsense. We'd warned, we'd dropped leaflets with vague warnings about the future, and actually we did drop, the only leaflets we dropped warning of the atomic bomb actually fluttered over Nagasaki the day after it was bombed. Another falsification is the actual bombing runs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki met no opposition from the Japanese at all. And so in the movie, however, to make it seem more brave and risky, they introduce the planes getting pelted with flak, with Japanese fighters in the distance. So it had to seem like it was an incredibly risky attack, and somehow we survived dropping the bomb, as opposed to it met no opposition whatsoever. So those things kind of reveal why they were so intent on putting this story out with the best possible spin.
But at least they took out the lie about Hiroshima, about the German scientist in the submarine going to for the nuclear plans, the nuclear bomb building facilities they had in Hiroshima. At least they took that out.
Well, that was fascinating. I mean, I have to say, possibly because this movie is far from famous, I'm quite certain I was the first person to go through all the scripts and changes at the Motion Picture Academy, of which there were, this went on for a full year. So I had to wade through dozens of scripts. But it was fascinating to see if I could pay attention to each small change, each small, and they often were in pencil or pen, and other things that were struck out. So with looking at this minutely, one could see exactly what was going on. And so one could see how over time they kept adding more references from Groves or Truman, referring to maybe the Japanese have atomic bombs themselves, or we're told, our experts are telling us, Japan might meet our invading forces with their own atomic bombs. And of course, this is ridiculous. Japan never got far with its nuclear program. And then, as you mentioned, it culminated in a full scene where Japanese greet a German scientist who lands off Tokyo, and he has the plans for the German atomic bomb. He's giving it to Japan. Japan will then have the bomb, and of course, the kicker is the Japanese scientist then heads off to their main atomic laboratory in Hiroshima. So, I mean, what could be more connect the dots? We had to drop the bomb on Hiroshima because they were building an atomic bomb to hit us with there. As you mentioned, even that was too much for Groves. Groves was okay with the rest, but he kind of drew the line at that scene. So that was never filmed, as far as I know.
But even with that taken out, they still perpetuate the underlying lie of Hiroshima as being a military target, or
Right.
military city, as opposed to a city that had, some textile plants and maybe, a couple of factories, but was never a military enclave.
Yeah, well, they had a military headquarters there, unlike at Nagasaki. Hiroshima did have a military presence, but number one, it was not mainly a military city. Number two, the target for the bomb was not the military base; it was the center of the city, residential city, and so they did not target the military base. But Truman, even in the official statement released, the first official statement of the bomb that was released to the press, which had been weeks in the making, said flatly, hours ago we bombed Hiroshima, a Japanese military base or Japanese army base. Didn't say city, it was referred to as an army base or a military base. And they probably pretty much stuck with that as they went along. So they wanted people to believe that this was a real, that was the target, and not mainly targeted at killing civilians, which it accomplished, unfortunately. And the film had to reflect that again. We had to see that the Japanese not only had it coming, but we see in the movie Hiroshima on Fire from above, special effects, but we never get on the ground, and we never hear about survivors or victims. The early scripts, again, had scenes where American generals and others are on the ground walking around and seeing, even one script had they see a dead baby or burned baby or something. So all that was completely gone by the end. So there were, like I said, literally dozens or hundreds of such revisions.
You quote one of the scientists from the Manhattan Project as saying, dropping the bomb on Hiroshima was a mistake. Dropping the bomb on Nagasaki was an atrocity. Was Nagasaki both the last shot of World War II and the first shot of the Cold War?
Well, I think you could say that. There are some people who are going back for decades now who claim, historians who claim that the main motivation for dropping the bomb was to warn the Russians about who was boss, in the post-war world, and there could have been no other reason for it. Really, I've never embraced that. I think that might have been one factor. I think it's complex, the reasons for dropping the bomb, or the reasons it ended up getting used. I think that's a factor. But you could say it was the first shot of the Cold War, because we were showing we did have the bomb. Russia didn't. It certainly motivated them to build their own bomb. And then the same thing happened with the hydrogen bomb. We tested our hydrogen bomb, and then they tested their hydrogen bomb. So years later. But Nagasaki, you could devote a whole program to it. But essentially, as I show in the book, it was the first example of automated atomic warfare. The only example so far, fortunately. It's basically there was no separate order to use the bomb. It was, the order from Truman was, use the bombs as they become available. He never took care after Hiroshima to intervene. He never said, wow, boy, we destroyed a whole city and killed tens of thousands of people. Maybe I should check in on this using a second bomb, especially since the Japanese were already sending out peace feelers. And he never did. So Nagasaki was bombed 3 days later. It seems to have had a little effect on Japan, which was already reeling from the war to begin with. Second, the great fact that is so rarely shows up in these in the media we see this today is that Russia's entry into the war, as we demanded on August 8th, a little before Nagasaki. We demanded it. Truman himself in his diary had written that when Russia did declare war, which we were demanding, "Finny Japs" when that occurs, he wrote, meaning the Russia entry alone would spark a Japanese surrender, even without the use of the atomic bomb. As I mentioned earlier, it's so revealing to look at Truman's own diary. So there were numerous reasons for Truman to intervene after Hiroshima. Give the Japanese a few more days. See what these peace feelers amount to. See what the actual effect of the Russian entry into the war would produce. And he did none of those things. And so Nagasaki was bombed. And as I mentioned, I think it's pretty much a consensus that the total number of military personnel who were killed was about 250 out of maybe 90,000 who died. So it's why it was morally troubling from the beginning, and probably even more so today.
I can understand why in 1946 they'd have an actor like Brian Donlevy play General Groves, a good-looking guy, a little trimmer than General Groves.
Quite a bit trimmer.
But for Roland Jaffe to have Paul Newman play General Groves in an ostensibly anti-war movie was really confounding, bewildering, and counterproductive.
Yes.
Why did he do that in Fat Man and Little Boy?
Well, as I show in the book, there's only been three. This is probably the bigger problem, is there's only been 3 Hollywood movies on this subject in 75 years. The one that's the subject of my book. Then there was one about 6 years later, which was almost a sequel or a remake with focusing on the Hiroshima pilot, Paul Tibbets, with Robert Taylor playing him from MGM. And that film didn't do all that well either. Above and Beyond was the title. And then not another movie till around 1990 when Roland Joffe, the director of Killing Fields and other movies, made Fat Man and Little Boy, focusing on Los Alamos, really. He didn't even really get to Hiroshima. But, telling the story of some debate over using the bomb. And he did, I talked to him for a previous book, and he really wanted to make it more of an anti-nuclear type film, but he made the fatal mistake of casting Paul Newman as General Groves and relative unknown Dwight Schultz as Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was supposed to have some of the conscience in there, and it was such a mismatch. Even reviewers at the time said, why? Why did he do that? And that was 30 years ago, and there hasn't been another movie, a Hollywood movie. There are plenty of documentaries on the subject, but the Hollywood movie, 3 movies in 75 years, 1 movie in the past 68 years. So think about that. Here's some say the most important event of the century, certainly one of them, an event with the U.S. at the very center, and 3 Hollywood movies. So it's interesting to speculate on why that might be.
Maybe the problem was how much trouble MGM had dealing with the scientists in getting releases. We're talking with Greg Mitchell. His new book is The Beginning or the End, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. How important was it to MGM to have those releases from Oppenheimer and Einstein and Fermi and so on? And how hard was it for them to get?
Well, it was very hard because most of the scientists they wanted to show, Oppenheimer, Einstein, Leo Szilard, were all to varying degrees, by that point particularly, very either hostile or conflicted about the bomb, about their role in making the bomb, especially the use of the bomb. Leo Szilard was the one scientist who launched a petition campaign to try to get Truman secretly to get Truman to hold off using the bomb. Einstein was probably the leading, after the use of the bomb, leading critic of the use of the bomb, or at least the leading egghead, a critic of the bomb, and making more bombs, very anti-nuclear. And as we've mentioned, Oppenheimer was extremely conflicted about the whole thing. So there was reason for MGM to be concerned about that. So the book kind of shows, sometimes it's a little humorous, the extent to which MGM went to try to cajole them into signing these releases, which all of them ultimately did. They kind of gave up and did do that. But at the same time, the book shows while all this was going on, those 3 men were being surveilled by the FBI because of their alleged left-wing views. Oppenheimer's phone was bugged, and I print a part of a transcript of him talking to his wife about this movie, about how bad this movie is, but how he was about to sign a release. So again, there's a lot of black humor there. The movie's awful, but I think I'm going to sign this release from an FBI phone tap. Szilard was followed in the street. His mail was open. Einstein's mail and phone calls were monitored. And so forth. So this was all going on at the same time MGM was chasing them.
That's a wonderful thing for an author to find actual wiretaps of his subjects to talk about the. It must have been a great day when you realize,
right? Yeah,
you realize what you had. And just for the record, they weren't alleged left-wing things.
Well, that's true.
I mean, Oppenheimer's
alleged communist.
Yeah, well, Oppenheimer's
alleged communist, right? Alleged communist.
Yeah. As I mentioned, the construct of this show is that it's Madison authors and topics and so on. And on January 1st, 1946, there's a football game played in the rubble. While in Pasadena, USC and Alabama are playing the Rose Bowl, there's a football game going on in Japan called the Atom Bowl. And the fight song they played during that game, Greg Mitchell, was what?
On Wisconsin? Is that the correct title?
That is the correct title. So
Okay.
we have our requisite necessary Madison linkage there to justify the show. And also, anybody who publishes Bruce Springsteen gets special
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
dispensation.
Thank you.
We've got about 8-9 minutes left. Let's talk about the John Hersey article but the John Hersey story in the New Yorker of August 31st, 1946, Hiroshima, and how powerful that article was that it occasioned an attempted rebuttal by the Secretary of War. Talk about John Hersey and Henry Stimson.
Okay, well, most people know the beginning of the story, which is John Hersey wrote the first real, a year after the bombing. And, there's a lot of suppression going on. There was a censorship office in Tokyo, U.S. reporters, photographers, their work was killed or censored. And so Americans were being kept from seeing the full evidence of what happened in Hiroshima. So John Hersey went over there, researched it, came back and wrote a massive article that took up the entire feature space of the New Yorker, and which was unprecedented. And it caused such a sensation around the country, incredible press coverage. It was read in its entirety on national radio. It really looked like it might threaten this official narrative, much like the movie, in a far more serious way. So you had at the same time the movie that we've been talking about, the MGM movie, which was in production and was already being heavily revised. And now you had the John Hersey article. And so in some way, the same thing happened with the article, which was soon to become a best-selling book. They put it out as a book very, very shortly after. Truman and his allies decided that they needed basically a rebuttal, and that they needed a cover story in another famous magazine, Harper's, and they wanted the former Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, to write it. And they provided drafts to Leslie Groves and other people, McGeorge Bundy, and others wrote drafts that for Stimson to crib from. And Truman asked him to do this. So it was basically a plot to get an answer article in another leading magazine. And it succeeded. Stimson's article appeared as a cover story in Harper's in early 1947. Detailed the decision to use the bomb with, again, a lot of things omitted that we've already talked about. But it was, it was weighty. It was from an insider, and it worked. From the New York Times on down, the media accepted it as gospel. They said, this settles the question. And thank God, thank God for the atomic bomb. Thank God that Stimson wrote this article. And so there was this turning point. Again, come back to this turning point. This movie, the John Hersey article, other things. Norman Cousins was writing great pieces. There was a real opportunity there for America to turn from the nuclear path, certainly to reconsider the use of the bomb, which as I mentioned earlier, is so important. The lesson that we get today that the bomb can be used, the precedent that using the bomb set. And rather than saying, well, it came at the end of a horrible war, we can understand why it was used, but it really shouldn't have been used. That's not the lesson. The lesson is, well, it was actually a good thing it was used, and so forth. But we had an opportunity back in 1946 to get off that path. And as we saw with the movie, and certainly with the Hersey article, the media particularly wanted to turn the page and move on and let it be a settled question. And so, I could say it worked, with the movie and the Stimson article, they won.
Now, did Stimson believe what he signed his name to? Because it seems that he should have known the reality of the situation and had some more deeper thoughts about it than were expressed in the article. Did he believe what he signed his name to?
Well, his diary and his letters show he had great doubts. He was one of, I wouldn't call him a dove by any means, but he was among the Truman advisors who, when the decision to use the bomb was being discussed, who often raised questions, including we haven't even talked about one of the other crucial elements or options that America had in not using the bomb was to tell the Japanese out front that they could keep their emperor. Instead, we refused to do that, and then let them keep the emperor after we used the bomb. And Stimson was one of those who believed that giving them that assurance out front would have speeded their surrender. So like I said, Stimson did have some doubts, which he more or less overcame. When he was asked to write this article by Truman himself, he agreed to do it. And then as he was writing it, revealed doubts. And I'm going to be remembered as this, cold-blooded, backing cold-blooded killing and all these other things.
Instead of a kindly Christian gentleman.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Exactly. And so, but he went through with it. He was part of the process. He had a reason to defend it. But like so many then, including Oppenheimer and others in Truman's crowd, they privately expressed some doubts and qualms, but they couldn't say anything publicly because it would have raised too many questions and thrown their own role into reappraisal. So there was certainly an incentive to stay on this the path of this official narrative.
And after all the studio hoopla about how great and important the movie is going to be, it finally opens in February '47, gets middling reviews, and dare I say it, is a box office bomb.
Mm-hmm. Well, you just said it, so I guess you dare say it. And you're not the first to say that. But it didn't do well. It lost money. It was not completely ignored by any means, but especially for an MGM movie, it was rare to really lose money, and it quickly disappeared. You can watch it now on DVD. Turner Classics owns it and re-airs it. You can watch a little bit of it online, I guess. But it was a semi-flop. Yet MGM tried again, as I mentioned earlier, with this Robert Taylor movie, and then that was it until 1990. So, but just the one point I would make is that the one reason it didn't do well was because of all the revisions and then reshooting key scenes. It came out like 6 months after it should have, and so by that time, people were getting, I guess, weary of the subject, and so it really didn't have much of a chance. So they shot themselves in the foot. If their goal was to have not many people look at the subject, then they succeeded. If their goal was to have a highly watched, money-making movie, then they failed.
And what about Donna Reed, who indirectly started it all? Apparently, she had no particular interest in the subject when all was said and done.
Well, she, as I mentioned, she was not in the movie, but what was interesting, she was a classic Hollywood Republican, of which there were many, many then. Sane, nice person, but definitely a Republican. And then in the 1970s, partly because of Nixon, certainly because of the Vietnam War, she became an anti-war activist. She was the local leader of Another Mother for Peace. And then in the 70s, she campaigned against nuclear power after 3 Mile Island and all that. So she became a feminist, all these wonderful things. Unfortunately, she died fairly young from cancer, but she certainly became a liberal political activist in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s.
But did she have? Do we know if she ever saw the movie?
No, there's no. Well, she may have seen it. There's no evidence that she did. There's no evidence that Oppenheimer was invited to the premiere. He refused to go. So we don't have his words on the subject. We don't have Einstein's words on the subject. But, any number of them might have seen it and just were embarrassed. Leo Szilard, as I quote in the book, did see a screening in Chicago and fled afterwards, hid in the back seat of his friend's car. And later said, if our sin was to build the atomic bomb, our punishment was to have to watch the beginning or the end. So that pretty much encapsulates his view.
Well, we don't have Oppie's views or Einstein's views, but thankfully we do have Greg Mitchell's views. That is all the time we have. My thanks to Greg Mitchell. Again, the book is The Beginning or the End, How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. One book event this week to tell you about. Tomorrow night at 7, our friends at Mystery to Me Books are hosting a virtual visit by author John Galligan, talking with our buddy Doug Moe about his new thriller, Dead Man Dancing. You can find more info on that at mysterytomebooks.com. Next week on Madison BookBeat, a replay of our recent conversation with Sarah Kendzior about her very alarming new book, Hiding in Plain Sight, The Invention of Donald Trump and the Erosion of America. Spoiler alert, things are even worse than they appear. For now, on behalf of News and Public Affairs Director Shali Pittman and all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for joining us. As Ben Sidran plays us out with a little bit of Little Sherry, please stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You're listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio. And we're out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, that was terrific. When you